Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Zainab Daodu. I'm a senior technical writer. I've worked with organizations like Google, Tilium, Cisco, and contributed to open source projects like Jenkins and Wikimedia. And I'm also the founder of WriteTech Hub, a technical writing agency that provides technical writing services to organizations. And we also have like a community of technical writers where we have programs and initiatives to help technical writers upskill and get them ready for the job market. Aside that, I'm also an open source programs manager and diversity advocate. So I create programs for open source programs, both at WriteTech Hub, and I've done that at She Code Africa also, where I created programs to get African women involved in open source. So I'm super excited to be on this session today. I'm really looking forward to it. I wish I could attend physically, but I'll try to make it as engaging and value-driven as I can. So I'll be talking on crafting user-friendly documentation, and we are going to be touching on this point. So we're going to be looking at why good documentation matters, different types of documentation we have in open source, information architecture for open source documentation, structuring documentation for clarity, using visuals effectively, feedbacks, and then we're going to look at, try to look at live documentation critique, and then common mistakes to avoid. So let's get into it. So initially, this presentation was supposed to be strictly like practical, where we just look at like a sample documentation, look at the issues with the documentation and try to fix it. But I added a bit of an intro just to touch on like the different types of documentation we have in open source and all. So by the end of this workshop, beyond the intro on open source documentation, we'll look at, creating clear structured documentation. It will try to be as hands-on as possible, considering the fact that I'm speaking virtually. And then lastly, we'll have like a checklist that open source projects can use. So let's get into it. I know a lot of people might say, yeah, they understand what documentation is, but I think we still need to speak on why we still need to speak on the importance of good documentation and challenges of poor documentation. So good documentation, especially for open source projects, makes it easy for contributors to contribute to the project, helps maintainer, like reduces the load on maintainers because a lot of information is already answered in the documentation, and it's easy for people to find and do what they need to do without having to rely on maintainers. It makes it easy to navigate the project, understand what the project is about, and help users achieve their goals. And, it makes your project more inclusive and accessible to a lot of people. When documentation is bad for open source project, a lot of contributors find it difficult to come in. They find it difficult to navigate. They find it difficult to contribute. Even in terms of using the products, people have difficulties because they have to reach out to support, reach out to the maintainers, drop questions in the community, which takes a lot of time and resources. So, and then we have the issue with information, and then also no feedback loops. Users or contributors are not able to give feedback on the documentation, and this causes a lot of frustration. So for open source projects to be able to resolve these issues with documentation, there are at least some key, this is not all, but some key documentation that all open source projects should have, and not just have. There are a couple of information that needs to be in those documentation to ensure that it's, achieve the purpose of the documentation. The first is README file. When people come to open source project, the first thing they see is the README file, which tells them a little bit about the project, an introduction, what they can do with it, and not just what the product is about, how they can get started, why it's important. And then you have the contribution file that tells people how to contribute to the project, how to get started, where to ask questions, how to open issues and things like that, how to open PRs. Then the code of conduct that tells community members how to interact. We have the license files, the change log, user guides and tutorials, and API documentation. So this is not to cover like all types of documentation, but at least all open source projects should aim to have like this basic documentation well updated within their open source projects. And then what are the things that should be in this different documentation? We have the README. This should have like a project name and a description, explain what problem the project, the open source project or the product is solving, and not just, defining the product. A lot of projects or a lot of products or a lot of open source projects made the mistake of just focusing on defining the projects. Like this project is this and this and this, but not how users can use this project. You can use this project to solve this and this problem. So that tends to make it easily relatable to people. And once they see the project, they can understand how it helps them solve their problem. Installation instructions, basic usage examples, basically like a getting started guide, sort of, to help contributors or users quickly get started on the project. By the time they are done with the README file, they should be able to understand where they need to go next or what they need to do next, depending on why they are on that open source project. And another key thing to the README is to keep it simple, structured. Putting too much text in the README file often like overwhelms people, and then at the end of the day, they just leave the project because there's so much information and they don't even know how to get started or what to do with all the information. So it needs to be clear what the purpose of the project is and what they can do with it and what to do next. Next, we have contribution guidelines, which tells people how to contribute to the project. This helps maintainers maintain contributors well. You can always direct them to the contributor guideline and not have to repeat the same thing over and over again. So we have the contribution guidelines should include links to style and standards for them to contribute. How can they get started on contributing? Are there processes to contributing, creating pull requests or issues and things like that? How can they test? Basically something that takes someone from the beginning of opening a pull request or submitting all the process that they need to submit a particular contribution to the project, without needing to go to the community to ask questions or ask the maintainers questions like, oh, how do I need to do this or do that? The next is the code of conduct. This typically follows the contributor covenant. It has guidelines to ensure that all community members, follow a certain standard within the community, especially to maintain inclusion and diversity within the community. Next, we have the information architecture. This is really important for like open source projects. You could have all the information that you need within your open source project, but then people are still not able to find where the content is within the project. So it's important to keep like a well-structured documentation repository that helps, contributors easily find information. Things like your README, contributing guide should be in the root of the repository where they can easily see it and get started. And then you can have your doc structured, within sub-repositories, well-structured so they can easily find whatever it is they're looking for. Another good thing also I've realized about structuring is if you're hosting your GitHub repository whereby you have like a website, or something, it also helps to maintain kind of like the same navigation between the links and the repository structure. Because then if somebody is coming to your repository from a particular page, for me personally, I tend to like kind of like use the link parts to try and see if I can find the documents or the file within the repository. If that doesn't work, then I begin to search like every other or try to read every other section to find where it is. So yes, that is the intro part of this session. So now we're going to get into the more practical section. Now that we've looked at the different types of documentation, part of the documentation we touched on was user guides and API documentation. So we are going to look at like a bad API documentation, a bad user guide or a getting started guide, and identify the issues with this getting started guide and then solve it, and then solve the issues. So I don't know if this is any clear, but I'm just going to try and explain as much as I can. So this is a getting started guide for Company X that helps users get started with the platform. They need to create an account, upload upload data, and then connect to analytics and things like that to get started. So this is a version of the getting started guide, but this guide has a lot of issues. And these days I see a lot of documentation like this that, even though yes, it has a couple of information in the documentation that is quite useful, it's not very easy to follow. There's no clear outcome in this documentation to show users like what they can actually achieve by completing this user guide. It doesn't explain how they can apply it to their business needs or whatever issues that they might have on their own end. It doesn't have clear steps to show like, okay, even though yes, we have creating an account, explore data, upload features and all that, people still need to follow some certain sequential steps to be able to create an account or upload data features. Scanning these documents doesn't really make that clear. You kind of like really have to kind of like scroll through, assume a lot of things for you to figure out the steps that you need to achieve that particular steps. Then the steps are also disconnected. It doesn't show like how the different steps within this documentation are related. It just explains them as individual. Do I need to upload data features to connect to analysis, or are they just separate things individually and things like that? And then the whole wall of text. So this documentation could serve some users, but the truth is that it will take a lot of users time to be able to figure things out. And most people don't even take the time they need to figure things out. Instead, they begin to come and start asking questions or creating support tickets, when they are not sure of what to do. They don't want to break anything within their system. That example that we showed is like a pretty basic example. These steps could be something more complex, where people are in a complex system, or they're in the production environment, or they are testing and they don't want to take chances. So they need to make sure that everything is clear. If not, they're creating support tickets or they're asking questions. So this improvement here is the same guide, but then it looks longer, but it's not really longer because it's easy to skim through. Like I can easily see what I need to do in sequential steps when I get here. I know everything that is expected of me. It is clearer. When you read the introduction of the guide, it tells you like, what you can use this guide to do for yourself, and not just what the product is. It explains like you would upload your data set, you can track key sales, it tells you what you'll be able to achieve, what business need that you can achieve by completing the guide. And then by the end of the guide, you'll be able to manage your data, gain insights and all that. So by the time you read the introduction of this document, you already know what you aim to achieve or what you're going to achieve by the end of it. And the thing is, once you define your intro with what you intend to achieve, your document should not go outside of the scope that you have defined. If you want to explain anything outside of the scope, or maybe you need to link to additional information, it's better. But then when people begin to see things that were not in the scope of the documentation, it confuses them. Now we have clear headings and then the different steps. Initially in the previous document, we have connect to analytics and all that, but it doesn't really show that you have to do all these steps here to connect to analytics. When people see this, they can easily tell this is what I need to do. Once you do this, I don't think anybody is going to be calling any support or reaching out to anybody seeing this kind of documentation, because they know everything they need to do. And then it goes further. When they finish explaining all the steps, it has next steps also to tell them where else in the documentation they can go to continue what they need to. So that user journey is also very important. A lot of times you see user guides, especially for like some projects, when you finish reading the README file or you finish reading whatever document you are on, it just stops there. You don't know what to do next with what you have learned on that page. You don't know where to go next with what you have seen, with all the information that you have. And then you now begin to start opening different pages of the documentation to find out, okay, this is what I need to do next with what I've learned. So other things to note is simple things like using numbered steps for sequential steps, and using bullet points for steps that are not sequential also helps to kind of like create that, oh, okay, when I see 1, 2, 3, I need to do one first before I do two first, before I do three, and then on to the next. And then when you're using bullet points, these are just lists. You don't have to follow the list sequentially. We're just giving a list of items. When you read the titles also, the title tells you immediately what you are going to do in that particular section, and not gives you a name of the product. Sometimes you might be using maybe the name of this tool or feature that you use to analyze your data set is maybe analysis. That's what they call it in the UI. Then you see some documentation where the title is analysis, simply because that's what it is in the UI. But when the user is seeing analysis, what is analysis? What am I supposed to do with analysis? But then when you see analyze your data, you understand that, okay, this is what I'm doing in this step, and you don't have to figure out too many things. So from that initial documentation that we had, so we're able to break it down into like sequential steps using clear headings, use numbers. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so use numbers to show sequential steps, show next steps to guide users on where next to go in the documentation. So the truth about well-organized docs is that they help users find information faster. We talk about attention spans of people these days. The attention span is quite short, and it's even, translating into docs and all. So you need to be able to display information in a way that is clear, that people can easily look at it and grab whatever they need to grab without being frustrated and all. Sometimes it might not even be, another instances, sometimes it might not be that they need to do everything in this document. Maybe the person doesn't want to upload data sets, the person doesn't want to analyze data, the person just wants to set up preferences. When you look at these documents, you don't have to read the whole document to know what section of the document applies to you. So, and next, beyond the structure of the document, we also have like simplifying complex technical information. We always talk about jargons, like using jargons in documentation, and people seem to understand or claim to understand that they know what it means to not use jargons. But then again, you still read some documentation and then you see some words and you are like, what does this mean? For instance, in the previous documentation, the old documentation, in the intro, we had things like cutting edge technology, optimize workflow, like big grammar, which looks like good on first, at first point, maybe to marketing and all that, where they have, oh yes, we have this cutting edge technology. But then in terms of technical documentation, where somebody is trying to achieve a particular task, I don't think they want to know if the technology is cutting edge. They just want to know exactly what they can do with that particular documentation. So instead of using those kind of words, you just break it down into simpler words where they can easily see exactly what they are doing and not have to worry. The thing about one thing I've realized, like working on technical documentation and all that, is it's just best to say exactly what you are doing. Like, don't try to sugarcoat it. Don't try to, make it sound nice or funky using big words. If you are creating an account, simply say create an account. If you are using a tool, simply say use this. Not things like utilize, and all that, just to try and make it sound like more, maybe, I don't know, make the English sound look more good, better and all. So it's better to use simple phrases that people can easily, process or at first read, without having to kind of like read the documentation multiple times to understand what it's trying to say, or assume, have to assume what it means based on their own perspective or their own understanding. So those are the improvements here, using user-friendly language, things that people can easily relate to, writing like you are talking to someone, you are explaining something to someone and you want them to understand it. So because complex language always frustrates users, and clear and simple writing increases accessibility. When you write in simple terms, it's also easy for even people who are not English native, and all that, to easily understand what you are writing without all the big grammar and all. And then also in terms of like writing for accessibility, maybe when you want to translate and all that, when you have like simple content that is written in simple English and easy to scan, it's always easier to go through all those processes like translation, checks, and all that. So at the end of the day, this is the difference. Okay, this is the good documentation, and then this is like the difference between the two documentation initially. This just like has a lot of big words, a lot of assumptions and all that. This is, more structured, explains exactly what you want users to do without beating around the bush. So beyond like text and all, visuals also helps in enhancing open source documentation or documentation in general. But I've seen a lot of scenarios where people use visuals in the wrong way, simply because, yes, it makes the documentation look good, or they feel we need to include this visual so people see exactly what we are talking about. I've had some back and forth like with SMEs where you are writing maybe like a step-by-step guide, and then you want to include screenshots in each of the steps to show exactly what you're explaining. So screenshots or visuals or images in documents should not replace explanation, and in most cases should not just show exactly the same information that you are putting in the text. So what I'm trying to say, for instance, is you have like a documentation and then you're explaining like click this button, and then you put a screenshot that just shows the button, and this is in an intuitive like position in the UI where people can easily see it. It's not like it's hidden, it's not like it's complex. That screenshot doesn't need to be in the documentation, because to be honest, it's not really serving any purpose. It's not like people are coming to the documentation to see, oh, what does this button look like, or where is this button in the UI. So screenshots should only be used like in situations whereby they are explaining maybe complex processes, or maybe things that you feel might not be intuitive enough for users to find in the documentation. Visuals should also not replace text, because for accessibility's sake, things like screen readers and all that cannot see what you have like in your screenshot, at least for now, because I've seen scenarios where you have screenshots in documentation, and then you annotate those screenshots and then put descriptions inside the annotations in the screenshots, but then this all those information is in the screenshot is not available within the text. So it means that anybody that is not able to see that image, or if for instance for any reason maybe that image is broken or that image is not visible, that context is already missing from the documentation, because all those information is only there. So screenshots or images should only help to kind of like explain what you have already in the text, but should not replace the explanation in the text. Things like comparisons and all that have no business being in screenshots. So also it's also important to use like the right type of diagrams or flow chart or screenshots for explanation. If you are explaining steps, use things like flow charts instead of screenshotting and all that. So label visuals clearly if you need to. However, do not replace these labels with the descriptions inside the documentation. Do not rely solely on the images to explain whatever concept or whatever it is that you are trying to explain at that particular point in time in the documentation. And then always ensure accessibility, alt text, contrast. Do not use like colors that could affect people. There are different color schemes and tools online to help you identify how to mix colors. For instance, sometimes you see like dark, you'll see like some images, visuals where you can even barely read or barely see what is in the visual or in the screenshot. In this way, it's really not serving any purpose to the users. Instead, it's just taking space. And then also, it's not advisable to have too many images in the same document, because then it begins, the more images you have in the document, the more difficult it is for people to navigate and find text hidden within the images. Imagine you have like a long document and then you have like 15 different images and then text embedded within those images. It makes it really hard for people to navigate those kind of pages, find text, or even follow the information that you have in the document. So it's always important to identify the best way to visualize whatever information that you want to visualize, so that you can ensure that you have like maximum user experience. Okay, so these are like a few tools for creating visuals. We have draw.io, Snagit, Mermaid.js. I personally use draw.io a lot. I've used Mermaid.js a few for like less complex designs, but I haven't used it like very much. So I just tried to drop these suggestions for creating diagrams. And then another important thing in documentation is gathering feedbacks. A lot of times you see documentations where you have feedbacks on the documentation, but there's no way to drop the documentation, to drop feedback instantly. So even if it's an open source project where people can go to GitHub repository, people shouldn't have to necessarily create issues to drop feedback on the documentation, because not everybody like has that time. So putting like a feedback functionality on the page, something that people can easily use to drop feedback, and tracking this feedback and using it to improve the doc is also a great way to improve the document. So this is another documentation. This is an API documentation also. It has a couple of information on it, but this documentation also has a lot of issues. The endpoint, I see this a lot. Use this endpoint to upload files. Yes, we know that this endpoint upload files, but we know that when uploading files, most times you have different kinds of formats of files to upload. Is it an image? Is it a PDF? Does it have a maximum size? A lot of times people have to figure out this information, and these are the kinds of questions that gets asked in support tickets. I'm trying to upload this image and this file, and it's failing. What's the reason? And they're like, oh, you're not supposed to upload an image, it's supposed to be a PDF. Well, it wasn't defined in the docs. Or, oh, the size of the image you are uploading is too high, but that information is not in the doc. So all these questions are things that could be solved in the documentation. So this says send a post request. The request format is not clear. The response, the expected response is not clear. There's no error responses in this documentation. There are a lot of questions and a lot of things that could go wrong with this documentation. And that's not to say this could not work, but then imagine like so many people having to come and ask you the same question multiple times when you can answer it in the documentation. So this is the same documentation. And now the truth is that like all the information in this place were actually applicable in the former documentation, but it just wasn't there. And a lot of times this happens from, maybe the person working on the documentation being too close to the product and just assuming a lot of things that, oh, you just need to upload file, and not even remembering that, oh, there are a couple of requirement or a couple of things that need to be included. So it's very important to think about things holistically when creating any kind of documentation, whether it's API and all that. I've seen a lot of sample API documentation that contains, yes, it contains all the, has the description, it has the endpoint, it has response, it has requests, but then I still have a lot of questions from from seeing the documentation, because it still doesn't answer a lot of questions. So this update now shows like, okay, you need to upload either a CSV, JSON, or Excel, and then it tells you like what you can use the data set to do once you upload it and all that. it has the authentication details, it has like all the parameters or whatever it is to send your request, it has the responses also, it has what a sample response looks like, and then all the error codes and everything described. So when you look at this particular documentation, the difference between this and the previous one, you have like every information that you need um, to kind of like improve. And then I think one way that open source project also can achieve like arriving at these kinds of documentation is by incorporating the feedback loop or feedback circle into the documentation, or even support. When people ask questions in the community or ask questions to maintainers or ask you questions that can be solved in the documentation, do you take those answers that you give to them and then go and update the documentation with the answers, or do you just answer the questions and then move on to the next thing that, oh, let's move on to the next task. So a lot of times these support tickets or these questions that come into the community should be documentation issues to improve the documentation, so you don't have to answer those questions repeatedly, because a lot of times we tend to miss out some of this information when creating the documentation initially because of being too close to the product or to the project. So you might not have as much questions as, you know, a user or someone who is going to come and use the documentation for the first time and things like that. So in that particular scenario, the best way is to now rely heavily on the questions that is going to come in once you've put out your first version of the documentation. Are people asking, oh, how many files can I upload at once? Is there a maximum number of files that I can upload? Even if you feel like, oh, this information was not relevant, but the more you begin to see, people begin to ask the question, then you know it's time to update the docs. And then when you are updating the docs, in what context would people need this information? This is where the information architecture and all that comes in. So people are going to be needing this information maybe at the point when they want to upload the file, or at the point where they've uploaded, they will need to know what's the maximum number of files you can upload, what's the size and all that. So it's very important to provide like all the needed information within the relevant context, because you might have your information somewhere else and people are looking for it elsewhere. That way it is not serving the purpose that it's meant to serve. So okay, so gradually communities. So I took out, I highlighted like some of the pitfalls or some of the mistakes that I've noticed like in a lot of open source documentation and ways that you can fix them. So the first one is outdated or missing documentation. So one of the best ways to keep outdated or missing documentation, keep documentation in sync with product releases, is to release docs alongside feature updates. A lot of open source projects have releases. I see like releases in the GitHub project. You can see like release cycles for different features and all that. Most times the updates to the documentation does not go alongside the feature releases. So at the point when you're creating an issue or you are creating a ticket, you know, for a feature, you should assess that feature for documentation at that same point in time, and you can even automate the creation of the documentation ticket using the feature ticket initially. You don't even have to like think of, oh, what documentation do we need yet? Just ensure that there is a task for documentation created alongside that feature that links to the feature issue or feature ticket. So once you have that, at least you can track the doc work for each feature release and then get it assigned, you know, open it up for community members or people to work on so it can go out with the features. Maintainers, you need to have maintainers also, or teams that are responsible for documentation. These people are going to be working side along the engineers or, you know, the developers to ensure that they are keeping the documentation in sync with the feature releases. Just like we have maintainers, we have open source projects that have maintainers for different features or different aspects of the project. We should also have maintainers that are dedicated to just the documentation and ensuring that the documentation is being kept updated and in sync alongside the feature releases. And I believe that this is possible. Those maintainers are also going to be responsible for ensuring that they, you know, monitor contributions from community members and all that. I've contributed to open source projects where documentation are just handled by the side by maintainers that are maintaining different features. So a lot of times it's usually like an afterthought, or when someone says like, oh, this feature is here, but you don't have the documentation for it. That's when they're like, oh, you can document it. It's not like it's in the plan of the project, or someone is really primarily responsible for ensuring that the documentation is up to date. And that's why a lot of times the documentation is outdated. Nobody is responsible for it. Nobody is answerable to it. So it's just as contributors indicate interest, that's how documentation gets updated. And then another mistake I've seen is like assuming too much prior knowledge. So when projects are creating documentation, they skip like, you need to write for beginners first before building off of the beginners knowledge. So you should have things like prerequisites, even if you don't want to give in-depth you don't want to give in-depth information and all that. You can link to resources that can bring people up to speed with where your documentation is starting, so that it will help to set that context, and you can ensure that they are starting like, or they are at the level where they can consume whatever documentation you have, and it will be able to help them achieve what they want to achieve. So things like prerequisites, what knowledge do you need to have to be able to use this documentation or this particular feature? What do you need to have read, or where do you need to be at? So it's always important to have all those information. So writing for beginners first does not mean that all your content have to start from scratch, but just setting the right context and letting people know who you are writing for is just enough to not get people frustrated, and all that with reading the wrong content for them. And then the next is no standard documentation style. A lot of open source projects do not have like standard style. So depending on who is reviewing the documentation, PR depends on like what is going to be put out. And having a consistent style can save like a lot of projects, like a lot of time, because when you have like your style defined, if you don't have like a specific style, you can adopt like maybe Google Style Guide or Microsoft and all that. You can actually set up automations if you are hosting in things like GitHub or all these version control systems. You can set up automations to run checks against this your style guide, against PRs that contributors open. So once you have like this initial check set up, at least you can ensure that you are maintaining consistency in a way. Maybe checking for like, okay, what words don't we want to use in the documentation? How should it, different kind of, there's a lot of automations that you can set out in your documentation using GitHub Actions, and it automatically runs all these checks. You can even do link checks, so many things. So it automatically runs all these checks whenever someone opens a documentation PR. So even if you have different people reviewing the PRs, at least you can maintain a consistency on that end, and then take that load off of maintainers to be checking, oh, we don't use master, instead we're using main, we don't use this instead. You don't want to be repeating all those kind of information every time. So you can set up checks against your documentation PRs that flags all these things immediately. It can even drop inline GitHub comments that contributors can easily see exactly what the issue is, how to solve it, and they can go and fix all those issues before a maintainer even has to look at the PR. Same thing, inconsistent formatting. These are issues that can be solved with having a style guide. Do you want to use sentence case for your titles, or title case, or how do you want code snippets to be displayed? Do you have comments in your code snippets to explain how to use the code, list examples, use cases, and all that? Another thing is troubleshooting or frequently asked questions. So this is another way to also like answer people's questions without having to repeat same thing over and over. So if you have like a troubleshooting section and somebody asks question in the community, or a question keeps coming up in the community frequently, it's just to update this section with those questions, and then you can always relate people or even put it in the README file where people can go through those questions and answer whatever questions that they might have. So no search functionality. Some documentation have such search functionality, but they are not really good. When you search for a particular word, or you search for a particular, there's a way you'll be searching the documentation, you're looking for like a context, but then it gives you like every single word, every single position where that letter is in the documentation and not even the word. So it's not just enough to have search in the documentation. Is the search functional? Can people easily search for information within all the documentation resources that you have and find what they are looking for? Is there any centralized search? And then do you have real world examples and use cases? And then lastly, inaccessible documentation. This is really important. Accessibility guidelines in terms of like using images, in terms of like structuring, in terms of like repurposing content and all that, not ensuring that your content is not all reliant on the same format for the sake of accessibility and all that. So these are some common pitfalls I've noticed in like open source documentation, and a few like suggestions on how open source projects can resolve those issues. So yeah, the last but not the least is this checklist. So I just put together this checklist of like creating documentation for open source projects. So it kind of like summarizes everything, almost everything that I've talked about in terms of like clarity, accessibility and structure, creating documentation for APIs, examples, even security, and then contribution and community. That's things like the contribution guidelines and all, and then maintaining documentation and updating it. Okay, so this is my last slide and a recap of everything that I've touched up in this session. So good documentation is very, very important for accessibility and should not be an afterthought for open source projects. The same way you take your feature releases, the same way you know, plan ahead when you have a roadmap for your features and all that, is the same way you should have the same for your documentation, to ensure that whatever documentation you have is serving the purpose that is meant to serve. Because imagine you having a documentation whereby you have to maintain the documentation. You are spending time and resources maintaining the documentation, but then it's still not serving the purpose that is meant to serve. And the truth is that having good documentation processes takes a lot of load and a lot of stress of people, maintainers, and all that. At the organization where I work, we have like a documentation process where documentation goes out with feature release. Like nobody has to be rushing, nobody has to be scrambling, because right from when the feature is created, the feature ticket is created and all that, there is the understanding that documentation is going to be part of it. There is a documentation team on GitHub, and all they need to do is tag the documentation team on any new feature or any new documentation, and the documentation team already has that in their backlog or their pipeline. So documentation knows that, oh, this feature is going out on this say date or with this release, and then they can begin to follow up with the engineers and all that to ensure that the documentation gets rolled out alongside the features. Another thing that I even forgot to mention is even also change logs. When you maintain this kind of process, it's also easy for you to ensure that your change log is actually updated and has relevant, all the relevant information. You can tag tickets. It's great right now that there are a lot of automation processes that are available for organizations to use. These automation processes can also be used to ensure that docs are kept in sync. And then maintaining a clear structure is not enough to just have like a wall of text that explains. You need to ensure that things are clear and well structured. I read a post recently on LinkedIn that was saying a lot of content are looking perfect today because of ChatGPT, the way people are structuring content, bullet points, and all that. And I'm like, I've been using bullet points even before ChatGPT started. And I like bullet points because, especially for someone like me that gets like thrown off easily with like large walls of text, when I see bullet points or when I see numbered steps or when I see broken text into sections, it makes it easy for me to scan. It's not overwhelming for me to read, and I can easily get the information I need without feeling overwhelmed or, you know, not knowing exactly where I was in the text. The minute I take my eyes off the text and I look back, I can't figure out where I was. I have to kind of like still read for me to figure out where I was in the text. So simple language makes complex topic understandable. We've always said technical writing is about simplifying complex information. We cannot simplify complex information by using complex language or complex language. So um, say it in the simplest way possible. Um, Visuals enhance comprehension and engagement, but use them effectively. Do not overuse them or underuse them. And then continuous feedback improves documentation. Even the best documentation today can get outdated. So feedback is very important beyond all these processes to ensure that you keep your documentation up to date. So thank you very much for staying through my session. That's everything I had to share. Do you have any questions um, or feedbacks or anything you'd like to share?